The first light of dawn crept into the room, soft and tentative, brushing against the walls in muted strokes. Neil lay still, his eyes open and unblinking, as though caught between the lingering threads of sleep and the pull of the waking world. Outside, the blackbirds had already begun their morning chorus, their whistles and whoops rising in joyful crescendos that echoed through the quiet fields. It was a sound Neil had known all his life, a symphony of nature that once felt distant, but now stirred something unfamiliar within him. Hope. For years he had lived beneath a cloud, shrouded in the weight of isolation and grief. His mother's passing had left an ache that time had dulled, but never healed, a wound that had festered in the shadows of his heart. But now, surrounded by those who had come to stand by him, to share in his burden, that darkness began to falter. In its place, a flicker of warmth took root, fragile yet determined, like the first bloom of spring breaking through winter's grasp. With a sudden surge of energy, Neil threw off the blanket and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The wooden floor was cool against his bare feet, grounding him in the present moment. He dressed quickly, his movements purposeful, as though propelled by the promise of the day ahead. There was work to be done, yes, but also a growing sense that he wasn't alone in facing it. The sun had yet to fully rise, its pale light stretching long shadows across the yard as Neil stepped outside. The air was crisp and bracing, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and the distant tang of wood smoke. For the first time in a long while, the weight on his chest felt lighter, as if the care and love of those around him were slowly lifting him from the mire. The shack was still as Neil entered the main room, the faint crackle of dying embers in the hearth, the only sound to greet him. Edmund sat hunched over the table, his sharp features lit by the soft glow of a flickering lantern. Scribbled notes and tiny jars of powder were scattered before him, their disarray a testament to the late hours he had spent lost in thought. He looked up as Neil approached, a smile breaking the quiet concentration that lingered in his eyes. Neil raised a hand, gesturing subtly toward the kettle. Edmund's grin widened as he nodded. Without a word, Neil knelt to relight the embers, coaxing them back into life with practiced patience. The faint scent of smoke filled the room, mingling with the earthy aroma of the wooden floor. Soon, the gentle hiss of boiling water joined the quiet symphony, and 2 mugs of coffee sat steaming on the worn countertop. The 2 men stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under their weight. The day seemed reluctant to wake, the sun taking its time to rise through the low-hanging mist. The blackbirds had quieted, their joyful chorus replaced by a heavy stillness. Neil cradled his mug in his hands, savoring the warmth that seeped through the rough ceramic as he stared out at the horizon. "I've got a request," Edmund began, his voice breaking the silence. Neil glanced over, intrigued by the curious glint in the other man's eyes. "I've been hearing the sounds you and Zach have been working on," Edmund continued, his words measured but carrying an unmistakable excitement. "Those strange instruments, there's one with 9 strings, a lute of sorts. I want to play it." Neil regarded Edmund thoughtfully, a flicker of understanding passing through him. Edmund was a musician of rare talent, his mastery of melody and rhythm unmatched. If anyone could wield such an unusual device, it was him. Neil nodded, seeing not just curiosity in Edmund's request, but genuine intrigue, the kind that could yield unexpected brilliance. "All right," Neil said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Come with me." Edmund followed eagerly as Neil led him back into the shack, toward the room of objects. The space seemed to hum with latent energy, its shelves lined with devices that ranged from archaic to otherworldly. Edmund's eyes fixed on the 9-stringed lute-like instrument, his breath catching as he stepped closer. He reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against the strings, producing a faint metallic twang that resonated in the quiet room. Neil set up the instrument with practiced ease, adjusting the knobs and wires to ensure it was ready. "You'll want to use these," Neil said, handing Edmund a pair of cup-shaped objects. "Place them on your ears. It'll keep the others from waking while you experiment." Edmund grinned as he slid the headphones into place, his hands already moving over the instrument with an innate understanding. As Neil stepped back to leave him to his work, the faint twanging of strings drifted through the room, each note carrying a spark of intrigue and possibility. Neil paused at the door, glancing back with an approving smile. Edmund had taken to the strange device like a natural, and Neil felt a quiet thrill at the thought of him joining their dissonant tone assault. The morning stretched ahead, full of quiet determination and the promise of what was to come. The soft hum of activity filled the shack as the morning began to unfold. The others had already roused themselves, mugs of steaming coffee cradled in tired hands. Jacob stood at the worn countertop, his hair slightly tousled and his eyes half-lidded, the look of a man still teetering on the edge of sleep. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice gravelly with waking. Neil returned the greeting with a small smile, his own mug nestled between his palms. Jacob set his cup down and leaned against the table, his sharp gaze meeting Neil's. "We should prepare a spot," he said, his tone deliberate. "Out in the garden. A place to return the amulet when the deed is done." Neil turned to Zach, who was slouched against the wall, his hair resembling a bird's nest. Despite the bleary look in his eyes, Zach managed a crooked grin, nodding his agreement. The warmth of camaraderie lingered in the room, even as the weight of the task ahead settled over them. Jacob stretched, rolling his shoulders as though shaking off the remnants of sleep. "I've got a few last things to check," he said thoughtfully. "Neil, do you mind if I take a look around the farmhouse? The place has been quiet for too long." Neil hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking toward the farmhouse, visible through the window. The memories tied to that space felt heavy, but Jacob's intent was clear. "Go ahead," Neil said at last, his voice quiet but steady. Jacob nodded in thanks, his movements brisk as he prepared to leave. He paused at the door, glancing over his shoulder. "Ken knows what he has to do," he added, his tone light but firm. The air seemed to shift as the group went their separate ways, each man focused on his role in the final preparations. Though the weight of the task was undeniable, there was an underlying thread of determination, a sense that together they could accomplish what needed to be done. The day unfolded quietly, its rhythm dictated by the gentle breeze rustling through the trees and the distant hum of activity from the shack. Edmund was still engrossed with the 9-stringed instrument, his nimble fingers coaxing harmony from its alien design. The faint twangs of his experimentation filled the air, blending into the natural sounds of the plot. Neil and Zach worked their way down toward the farthest edge of the land, a secluded corner hidden by thickets of scrub and brambles. The spot was perfect, shielded from prying eyes and steeped in the stillness of the countryside. Together, they cleared the brush, hacking away stubborn roots and pulling free vines that clung tenaciously to the earth. The ground here was untouched, its soil rich and dark, and when they stood back to admire their work, the space seemed almost reverent, ready for the weight it was meant to bear. Neil hauled out his trusty tool, the donkers, a peculiar contraption he'd crafted years ago for sinking fence posts deep into the ground. The two spade-like ends of the long wooden shafts bit into the earth with ease, their reach extending deeper than any ordinary shovel could manage. Zack watched with intrigue as Neil demonstrated the technique, his movements confident and sure, born of years of practice. Together, father and son worked in tandem, sinking the tool deep and hauling out the dense soil. The hole grew steadily, its depth reaching a point that even Neil was satisfied with. The task had left them sweaty and tired, their breaths coming in short puffs as they leaned on the tool for a moment's rest. Neil turned to Zack, his expression somber but calm. "This is important," he said, his voice steady. "You need to understand the dark grip of the music, how it can take hold if you let it." Zack shook his head, brushing a stray lock of hair from his brow. "I'm not a fool, father," he said simply, his voice edged with quiet determination. Neil nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I know," he replied after a pause, relieved that Zack at least understood the gravity of what they were doing. But it was a father's instinct to remind, to guide, even if the warning had already been received. As they trudged back toward the shack, the freshly dug hole behind them stood as a silent testament to their preparations. The weight of Jacob's instructions still hung in the air, shaping their movements and sharpening their focus. Though the day was far from over, Neil felt a small swell of pride. His son's resilience and the unity of their efforts gave him hope. For now, that hope was enough. The air inside the farmhouse was thick with stillness, a quiet that felt almost sacred. Jacob stepped through the doorway, his boots stirring a faint cloud of dust as they pressed into the worn floorboards. The rooms were dim, lit only by the soft light streaming through the grime-coated windows. But even in the half-darkness, Jacob could sense the echoes of a life once vibrantly lived within these walls. The faint aroma of dried lavender lingered, mingling with the earthy scent of time and disuse. His sharp eyes took in the details: a chipped teacup resting on the edge of a forgotten table, a faded apron draped over the back of a kitchen chair, and a cluster of tiny ceramic animals lined up on the windowsill. They were the pieces of Jean, small but meaningful conduits of her presence, each one humming softly with the warmth and joy she had brought to this place. Jacob's gaze fell on a dusty woolen hat hanging on a peg by the doorway. Beneath it, nestled like a forgotten treasure, was a pair of spectacles. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the soft, worn fabric of the hat before lifting it carefully. For a moment, and in the quiet of his mind, he saw her, Jean, framed by the kitchen window, the spectacles perched lightly on the tip of her nose, and the woolen hat sitting snugly atop her silver hair as she stared out towards the fields with a serene smile. The image faded as Jacob opened his eyes, a weight pressing gently against his chest. These were not just objects. They were pieces of her essence, fragments of the light she had brought to Neil's life. With a quiet resolve, he tucked them away, recognizing their importance for what lay ahead. As Jacob stepped back into the cool morning air, he paused in the doorway, glancing one last time at the little dwelling that had seen so much life, love, and loss. He drew the door closed with a soft click and whispered, as if to the house itself, "He will be fine." The path back to Neil's shack was uneven, the overgrown grass brushing against his boots as he moved with purpose. The weight of the woolen hat and spectacles in his hands felt significant, not heavy, but charged with meaning. He knew they would serve a role beyond their simplicity, anchors in the storm of what was to come. Jacob's figure soon disappeared into the back of Charnwood, leaving the farmhouse behind, a place of memories now imbued with the promise of hope. The weight of the night ahead hung heavily over the group, but none bore it quite like old Ken. His role was crucial, not for spells or songs, but for ensuring that what was about to unfold in Charnwood stayed there, without interference. Tonight, the air would be filled with sounds not of the natural world, no gentle rustling of leaves, no distant call of an owl. Instead, a cacophony would rise, sounds sharp and unearthly, enough to chill the soul and freeze the blood. The people of Castlefield, steeped in generations of old tales and warnings, would surely feel the unnatural pulse of the night. Those brave or foolish enough might leave the safety of their hearths, driven by curiosity or dread, and in their haste they would turn to Charnwood, seeking answers and explanations for what they could not understand. It was Ken's job to ensure that no such inquiries ever got past the boundaries of Charnwood. He had been stationed near the entrance to the plot, where the gravel path narrowed and gave way to the ancient trees that stood like sentinels, guarding the land beyond. Ken was not a physical barricade, but a social one, wielding his personality like a shield. With a well-placed word or a quiet look, Ken could calm the most restless of villagers, dissuade the most foolhardy from wandering too far. If pressed, his booming voice carried the kind of authority that no one dared question, especially on this night. For the night of Samhain was as old as the hills themselves, a night woven into the fabric of the land and the hearts of those who lived upon it. Even the children knew the stories, whispered around fires on chill autumn nights, the tales of terrors that befell those who strayed on this ancient eve. Most would stay behind locked doors, their candles burning low, eyes wide with silent prayers that whatever roamed the dark would pass them by. But there were always the few who felt invincible, who ventured where they shouldn't. Ken was ready for them. He stood tall, wrapped in a thick woolen coat, his cap pulled low against the creeping chill of the evening. His posture was steady, unyielding, like the oaks behind him. There was a sharpness in his gaze, a readiness to meet any challenge with the strength and resolve that had defined him through decades of life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into shadow, Ken adjusted his stance, his eyes fixed on the faint trail of smoke rising from Neil's shack in the distance. The others had their roles to play, but so did he. Tonight, Ken was the gatekeeper, the last line of defense between the quiet folk of Castlefield and the unrelenting storm that would soon rage within Charnwood. The evening descended over the ancient countryside of England, its shadows stretching long and deep across the land. The air carried a chill, tinged with the faint scent of earth and the promise of storms to come. Inside Neil's humble shack, however, the world felt smaller, brighter, a sanctuary of shared purpose and unwavering loyalty. Before everyone took to their stations around the worn table, 5 men gathered as one. The soft glow of the lantern cast flickering shadows on their faces, illuminating eyes filled with determination and hearts bound by the weight of the task ahead. In the center of the table stood Neil's finest gin, its clear liquid catching the light like a beacon of shared strength. 5 wooden cups rested beside it, their simple design symbolic of the bonds forged between these unlikely comrades. Neil rose from his chair, his weathered hands reaching for the bottle. As he poured the gin with careful precision, the faint sound of the liquid splashing into the cups seemed amplified, punctuating the quiet with a sense of solemnity. His gaze swept over the faces of the men who had stood by him, not just in this moment, but in all the moments that had led them here. "I would like to thank you all," Neil began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "for your courage, your care, and your friendship. glanced briefly at Zach, a flicker of pride softening his expression. And my son. He straightened, holding his cup high in the air, his posture resolute. To friends, he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. To friends, they echoed in unison, their voices layered with warmth and strength as they raised their cups. The drink burned as it went down, its sharpness a bracing jolt that united them in shared laughter and the occasional cough. Zach sputtered mid-sip, his face flushing a deep shade of red as he gasped out, "And son!" His words drew a hearty laugh from the group, their camaraderie spilling into the room like a roaring fire on a cold night. Ed reached over, smacking Zach lightly on the back as the younger man grinned sheepishly, his embarrassment unable to suppress the joy of the moment. For a brief time, the weight of their mission faded, replaced by the simple, profound bond of friendship and shared determination. The night stretched on, quiet and still, and though the darkness loomed beyond the walls of the shack, here, in this moment, there was light.